All right, just like everything in nature, sometimes meiosis doesn't proceed correctly. When meiosis doesn't proceed correctly, something called nondisjunction happens. Junction means, of course, that the homologous pairs or the sister chromosomes are joined together. Disjunction is what they're supposed to do during meiosis, separating. Non-disjunction means they didn't separate correctly. And this can happen either in meiosis 1 with the homologous pair not separating correctly, or in meiosis 2 with the sister chromatids not separating correctly. Either way, we end up with cells that don't have the right number of chromosomes in them. If this happens on some chromosomes, it will be fatal to the embryo and it will result in a miscarriage. But there are some forms of nondisjunction that can produce surviving offspring. So here's an example of nondisjunction where the homologous pair failed to separate. So one pair separated and the other pair didn't, so we end up in meiosis 2 with one cell that has 3 pairs of chromosomes and one cell that only has 1. So then our gametes, our eggs or sperm, either have 3 or 1 instead of 2. They should have 2 chromosomes. If it happens in meiosis 2, then we end up, again, we have 2 normal gametes, and then 2 that one has 3 and one has 1. Okay, so either way, we can end up with either an extra chromosome or not having a chromosome. So let's say that the egg has the extra chromosome and the sperm is normal. Now we have a zygote, that's our fertilized egg, that has 5 chromosomes instead of 4. Now, mitosis doesn't care how many chromosomes there are. All the chromosomes are just going to line up on the metaphase plate. So this cell is going to be able to do mitosis normally. The problem comes when the genes are sending signals for how the embryo should develop. Then you may have too many signals being sent, and that can result in abnormal development and a miscarriage. If it happens on gene number 21, wherever it happens, we call it trisomy, meaning 3 somatic chromosomes. If it happens on gene number 21, it causes Down syndrome. And Down syndrome is characterized by some physical abnormalities, especially rounded and flattened face. Individuals with Down syndrome tend to be very short. They have heart defects, interestingly enough. Their mental and physical development is delayed, and they tend to have a shortened lifespan, although we have learned a lot more about caring for people with Down syndrome, and they are living much longer lives than they used to. So it's no longer the early death that we used to think it was. People with Down syndrome we now know can live a long time, although because they have heart defects, they sometimes do die young. So that is a result of nondisjunction, and it may be a result of nondisjunction either in the father or the mother. Either one could have provided the extra chromosome. And there is some evidence that as the parents get older, the incidence of Down syndrome increases. So either an older mother or an older father could have a higher chance of producing offspring with Down syndrome. Now, the other thing that can happen with nondisjunction is that it could happen on the sex chromosomes, and that's one of the ways that you can end up as intersex or as not typically male or female. If you have extra X, then you will have extra like hyper-feminine characteristics. If you have extra Y, hyper-male characteristics. You could also if you ended up with one of these that had only one chromosome, you could have a person who has an X and nothing else. We call that XO. That person will be generally female in development, although with abnormal genitalia, but not reproductively viable. They won't be able to reproduce. If that person ends up, if the embryo ends up Y0, meaning Y but no X, that will be a miscarriage. There are too many genes on the X that you have to have. Okay, you can survive with only an X, but you can't survive with only a Y. Okay, so there are several different ways that this can happen. And now I'm going to wait. Oh, there's a tangent there. Okay. The other cool thing is that because meiosis stirs the gene pool, constantly creates new combinations, recombined chromosomes, it is evolutionarily advantageous. So here's a really cool experiment that was done with these little worms that are called nematodes. They are an animal. They are multicellular. They're microscopic, and they have a fairly simple genome. So they're very easy, relatively easy to study genetically. So this word, Cenorhabdites elegans, or C. elegans, eats this soil bacteria called Serrata marcescens, S. marcescens. And if they eat it, then they get sick and die. So the other cool thing about C. elegans is that they can reproduce sexually or asexually. Asexually means they reproduce by mitosis. They can just create a clone of themselves. So this group, Levi, Morin et al., they did this study where they combined sexually reproducing worms with this bacteria and asexually producing worms with the bacteria. And they let them live for several generations to see what would happen. And what happened was that the sexually reproducing worms were able to evolve an immunity to the bacteria. So this is the control where the bacteria and the worms were replenished so that they didn't, essentially evolution didn't happen. In this one, the worms were able to evolve, but the bacteria weren't. They replenished with fresh bacteria. And then in this one, the worms and the bacteria both were able to evolve. So outcrossing rate is the rate at which the worms are doing sexual reproduction. So when the worms were evolving and the bacteria was also evolving, they were sexually reproducing more because individuals produced by sexual reproduction were more likely to have a new combination of genes that gave them an immunity to the bacteria. When the bacteria was refreshed, so the bacteria was the same as they had started with, the worms originally did sexual reproduction and then stopped and went back to asexual reproduction because they had evolved an immunity to the soil bacteria, and then they could just, by copying themselves, pass on that immunity to all their offspring. How cool is that? So it turns out that parasites and pathogenic bacteria and other things are actually one of the primary driving forces behind evolution. One of the main things that shapes how species change are the other organisms in the environment that can kill species off. And that is why sexual reproduction is valuable to a population, even though the process is very wasteful and time consuming. Think of all the time and energy we use trying to find a mate. Think of all the sperm wasted by plants. But the result is a population that is better able to respond to changes in the environment and therefore more evolutionarily advantageous. There we go. All right, and that's my